If you're going back to school, before you submit your essays, run it through Grammarly to quickly check for spelling, punctuation.
Make it hot. A quick way to
Yes, I can hear you. Of course.
Hey, Bethany or Joe, let me know when you think we have a quorum.
Chair, we do have a quorum.
Great, are you ready to begin? All right, it's a little after 1 o'clock and I'll call the September 22nd Planning and Programming Committee to order. Chairman Thompson is out of town this week, so I'll be sitting in for him for the meeting. First action item is, my first item is to approve the agenda. Bethany sent out a revised agenda earlier this week, and that's the agenda we'll be going with. Is there any changes or questions to that agenda as published? Right. Seeing none, we'll approve that agenda. Moving on to approval of the August 18th Planning and Programming Committee meeting minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything on the minutes we should be talking about? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion for the approval of the August 18th minutes.
Ashfeld move approval.
Thanks, Ken. Is there a second?
Brown seconds.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any comments or discussion on that? Seeing none, roll call, please. It's Bethany.
Jerry OJ,
Aye.
Darren Milkey,
Here, I'll abstain since I wasn't at the last meeting.
Doug Abier,
Abstain, wasn't at the last meeting.
Emily Buell,
I'll abstain since I wasn't at the meeting and I'll be filling in for Jason today.
Scott Merrick,
Aye.
Greg Jensen,
Aye.
Joe Ayers Johnson,
Aye.
Elaine Kotsukos,
Aye.
Cole Hinneker, Cole, Scott Janowiak,
Aye.
Molly McCartney or Jody.
Hi, this is Molly.
Thank you. Colleen Brown,
Aye.
Mike Samuelson,
Aye.
Nancy Spooner Walsh, Aaron Bartling,
Aye.
Carl Keel, Paul Omi,
Aye.
Robert Ellis, Brandon Brodheg,
I'll abstain since I wasn't at the last meeting.
Ashfeld,
Aye.
Nathan Coster,
This is Jennifer Hager here for Nathan, and I will abstain as I was not at the last meeting.
thank you, and Ann Weber.
Hi.
Thank you. The motion carries. Moving on, public comment on committee business matters. Did anybody sign up for anyone sign up for public comment?
We did not have anyone.
No one's on the line.
Nope.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to tab report, Elaine.
Thanks, Chair. TAB met yesterday afternoon. Debbie Gattell was the vice chair in Chair Hublin's absence. She reported that Dan Keeley had resigned as the Suburban Transit Association representative, and STA appointed Gary Hansen to be the representative now. So Metro Cities is recruiting to fill the city representative position that opened when Gary shifted his position. For MnDOT report, Michael Barnes said he did not have an update. For the MPCA, Todd Bewan reported that the Climate Action Framework was released last Friday, and the framework is organized around 6 goals, and the framework is on their website, admin.gov/framework. They also have, for populations less than $10,000, planning grant funds available. The grants would cover resiliency or upgrading infrastructure, etc. With the Metropolitan Airports Commission report, Kyle Crimmins reported that airlines are at 85 to 90% of their previous passenger levels. There are now 34 airlines at MSP Airport. They also have, for update of the transportation network companies, there are 28,000 licenses as of August, so between all the different ones that are out there. And they're averaging a fee of $3.42 to those networks. They have a new company, Turo, which is a peer-to-peer car rental, and they have a temporary grant available for 1 year. And right now it's successful, and they're working on licensing to go permanent. Based on this, the car rentals are behind 35% of previous work that they were doing. At MAC had 8 job fairs, and for the airport sales that they held last month to sell 370 million was successful. They actually received many bids for that, so that was over that they needed. And then Delta will be remodeling their G concourse. And then Sun Country set a record breaking for their passengers for this year. For the Metropolitan Council, Deb Barber reported that Metro Transit launched September 10th their microtransit, transporting people to the Sea Line. This is a new dial-a-ride type bus service, similar to the Prime in Southwest Transit, and MBT has service, and this is based in North Minneapolis. The Equity Work Group began meeting, and on October 19th, they will have groundbreaking of the Gold Line. The Suburban Transit Association, Maple Grove, reported the U of M had greater ridership than pre-COVID, and their microtransit is having high ridership. MBTA set ridership records in August, and their microtransit is growing. And Southwest Transit has increases in their prime ridership, which doubled from 2021. And they have started a student program hiring students in training type positions, and we can report on that later. And then for the TAC report, Solberg reported on the TAC updates that were made to the TAC bylaws. And the changes allows TAC members who are alternates to serve as chairs for the subcommittees. For business items, TAB approved the 2023 Unified Planning Work Program. This went through the TAC Planning Committee. And there are some unbudgeted funds in the UPWP. And there was a question on a TAB member on whether there's been discussion of setting up performance measures or a study for the local system bridges, pavement and crashes. If there's staff capacity, this project or others can be added through a UPWP amendment in the future. They also approved a program year extension for I-35W continuous lighting. And they approved 6 streamline tip amendments that went through TAC. Hennepin Avenue BRT platforms, which were included in a description of the bikeway project, that description was removed. The Bruce Bento Trail extension, they adopted amendment to add preliminary engineering for the extension of the trail. For the Coon Rapids Boulevard signal system, they added mill and overlay and a turn lane to CASA 1. This was with local funds. They approved Minnesota Highway 36 ramp reconstruction. The change to termini added a retaining wall and increased the cost for the Ramsey County's Highway 36 ramp reconstruction project. And then the Southwest Transit Mobility Hub project was added to 2023. They had an update on the RTO bus transit system. Katie Roth and Kyle Burrows provided update on the project ABRT that have gone in already, and then the ones that are under construction, and then those planned for the future. Bethany Brent Sargent provided update on the regional solicitation public tool results. And then there was discussion on the regional solicitation project ranking and funding scenarios. And I have a lot of comments on this. I don't know if you want me to go through these now or present them later when we go through the discussion on the solicitation.
Let's wait until we go through the solicitation. Thanks.
Okay. And that's all I have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elaine, for the update. Any questions for Elaine? Okay, hearing none, moving on. First, the action item for today is regional solicitation scoring appeal by City of Waconia for 3 scoring measures for the Trunk Highway 5 reconstruction application. Joe, are you going to give a little background on this one?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I believe that will be me. So I'll talk a little bit about this. So first off, we'll offer our apologies. We sort of missed this through the original process. The city did get their appeal to us on time, and it sort of fell through the cracks alongside the rest of them. So our apologies for that confusion and for to the city themselves. So second piece is that what I did here in creating this action transmittal is I followed the format I created last time. Well, the format I created last time included the full measure language. Those happen to be much shorter measures than these are, so this is a little bit clunky. So, but they're nicely broken up with requests 1, 2, and 3. So the city did provide 3 challenges. That is, challenges to 3 scoring measures for its Trunk Highway 5 reconstruction project. So I'll just talk about each of those 1, 2, and 3. And our interaction with the score. I was on vacation for a part of this discussion, so Elaine, you might know something from particularly one of the first 2 scores. I worked with the 3rd score. Yeah, so jump in if you feel like you need to. So we'll go to the first request, and this is revaluation of the equity population benefits impacts. For your reading pleasure is the entire measure. I don't intend to read that. I will tell you that their focus on the measure was 3B. 3A was about, you might recall, was about outreach, and 3C is about housing. This is the the equity population benefits and impacts. So the score that they received for this was 24 points. They received 25 points and then a -1 for potential negative impacts. So the applicant suggested that the score might have missed some elements from the application, such as pedestrian bicycle safety improvements, public health benefits, access improvements, travel time improvements, gap closures, new options, leveraging other investments, and community cohesion improvements. The score took a look at this and I'm sorry. Yeah, the score looked at the full response and so that the equity populations described in the application do not meet any criteria for any more points than it got, and that equity populations are lower and not as diverse compared to some of the other applications in the category, and therefore recommended no change. I think from our perspective, with a qualitative score, it is really difficult to show that anything was sort of missed or forgotten. So I don't know if you want me to get into the next measure or if people want to pause there for any questions.
Does anybody have any questions for that measure?
Or Elaine, if you had anything to add, because you did work a little more with this score than I did.
Yeah, the information I received from the score, I did include under the scoring review. So, and we did have some emails back and forth that the information that was submitted was included in their review or of the scoring. Part of the scoring being lower is like they did say they met the criteria, but compared to the other applications, this is how it was scored.
So the second one is pedestrian crash reduction, and the applicant's challenge here. So this is a 30-point application that they scored 11 points on, and the applicant's challenge here was a little bit shorter. So verbatim, There were unclear, well, not quite verbatim. The applicant was unclear on how the safety score was a reach of 11 out of 30 was reached, particularly getting less than half of the points when 2 of the 3 safety risk factors are present and 2 of the 4 safety exposure factors are present. While the project is providing dedicated trail facilities on both sides of the highway and exposing and where non-existent and exposure at the crossing of South Olive Street is reduced to the extent possible. And so the scorer reviewed this, and you can see a pretty monstrous scoring measure down below here, and determined that they didn't miss anything in the original scoring review, and therefore recommended no change. Way down on, I guess that's it for this one. The rest, the next 2.5 pages is the measure itself. So once again, Elaine, you worked with that score a little bit more than I did, so I don't know if you have anything to add. Otherwise, I would move on to the last one.
No, that the score just replied with a short message that they had accounted for everything that was in the appeal.
Okay, and then request 3 is the risk assessment, and they scored 61 out of 75 points. And we did share this with the scorer. Most of you probably know who that is, but and that score reported that there was no reason to give any additional points. Now, as I read this, I believed that the applicant thought that the measure was out of 100 points, and they were asking because what they frequently asked for was actually fewer points than they received, or as many points as they received. They seemed to feel that they deserved 75 out of 100 points when they actually got 61 out of 75 points. So they actually had a higher percentage than they seemed to be asking for. So the scorer did not feel that anything needed to be added to the score, and B, I actually feel that they got the points that they thought that they deserved and more. So with that, we would the scorer would recommend no change. So those are the 3 scoring measures and the results. With that, I would stand for questions, or Elaine, or I don't know if the applicant is here and want. I think we let the applicants give a short response last time, so maybe that's in order as well.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Elaine, is the applicant here with any comments?
I'm just looking at the comments, and when we're doing the scoring and the appeals, we don't look at ranking initially. So we didn't ask, or we actually reminded the scores when they were looking at the appeals not to look at how this project ranked. We wanted them to review it based on how they scored initially and whether they made an error. And we didn't want them being influenced by any rankings, so they didn't. And I'm not sure when I was going through it where this was ranked either.
Yeah, it's hard to. I know it's easier said than done, but ideally this would be reviewed on its merit more than on how without consideration for how it's ranked or whether or not any changes would move the project up. But you all have access. So
yeah, and like I said, or Joe mentioned, this appeal came in during the time frame, and I found an email letting the applicant know I'd received it and I was going to forward it on to staff and the scoring. And I did not find the email, because that was the process for every one of the appeals that came in. And so somewhere in the transition, it did not go through. So that was why it was missed. If it had gone through at the regular time, we would not have been looking at any rankings either.
Okay, thanks for that clarification too. Is the applicant?
They were invited.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see him on the list. So, okay, well, I'll open it up for questions or comments then to the committee.
Yeah, actually, Craig Eldred and Dan Lonis are both on the applicant and their consultant.
Oh, they are. Okay. So, do you gentlemen have any comments or?
I wouldn't have any comments to add at this point, so.
Okay, thanks. All right, so again, I'll open it up for committee questions or comments. Is there any questions or comments from the committee at this time?
Darren Melky, if I could.
Go ahead, Darren.
Probably a question for maybe more so for the applicant on that last measure. I know Joseph said they appeared to assume it was a 100-point scale instead of 75. Just wondering if the applicant confirmed that that's what they intended. or were meeting at the time.
I think they cleared it up as explained. I think it was per points per category. It seemed the score did not line up with the expected sum, and this basically aligned appropriately with the expectations. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions from the committee? I think it was fairly well looked over and comments made. All right, seeing no other comments or questions, I'd entertain a motion.
Scott Merrick, I would move the score's recommendation.
Okay, Scott, thank you. Is there a second?
Second by OJ.
Thank you, OJ. Great.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other discussion at this time? All right, hearing none. Take a roll call vote on this.
Okay.
Bethany. Thank you.
Jerry OJ,
Aye.
Darren Milkey,
Nay.
Doug Berry,
Aye.
Emily Buell,
Aye.
Scott Merrick,
Aye.
Craig Jensen,
Aye.
Joe Ayers Johnson,
Aye.
Elaine Kotsukos,
Aye.
Cole Hinneker, Cole, all right, Scott Janowiak,
Aye.
Molly McCartney,
Aye.
Pauline Brown,
Aye.
Mike Samuelson, Aaron Bartling,
Aye.
Paul Omi,
Aye.
Brandon Brodheg,
Aye.
Ashfeld,
Aye.
Jennifer Hager,
Aye.
Ann Weber.
Aye.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That motion passes. All right, moving on to informational items. We got a HSIP Highway Safety and Investment Plan update from MnDOT. Car, are you available? Or was
Yes,
someone
sorry.
else? Okay, thank you.
This is Corey Vestfog from MnDOT.
Right.
Let's see here. Do we have the list? Okay. And first thing I want to note is that, this is a tentative list. We got, I guess I should start with, we will probably be meeting next week, the scoring members to address. There is one issue that came up that three projects that were submitted did not make it to the scoring members. It was we did have some information that the UPS package was delivered, but it did not make it to us for the scoring. So like I said, this is a tentative list, and we're planning on probably convening next week to decide how to address that issue. Outside of that, we did get 59 projects submitted outside of those three. Of those 59, 40 were funded. The scoring members were Lars Impla from MnDOT, Derek Lure from MnDOT, Steve Peterson from Met Council, Lou Flores, representative from Ramsey County, and Chris Labonte from the city of Plymouth. I guess I'm open to any questions. We had a I think a lot of good projects submitted this year. Let me see here. Pretty much every city or county or MnDOT, pretty much anyone who did submit an application got on this tentative list got funded for at least one project. The breakdown this year happened to be more proactive projects than reactive projects. About right now, tentatively about 35 million for proactive and 27 million for reactive. Over the we were mainly looking for scoring 26 and 27, but there were some funds for from previous years for 24 and 25. So I guess I'm open to any questions at this point. And like I said, we will be following up probably this next week to try and see how to address those issues with those three projects.
Okay, great. Thanks for the update.
Looks like we have one
Yep.
question.
Yep. Yeah, Jennifer, do you have a question? Go ahead.
I do, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I have a couple process questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could explain the process by which the decision to go higher on proactive than reactive this go around was made. And in past go arounds, it's been pretty much the reverse. And
Right.
we're curious on how that decision was reached.
I think, and I have noted, there was a number of cycles ago. I know there was kind of like set amounts of, proactive versus reactive. In the past couple cycles, there has not been like a set limit. We've in those cases, it's kind of been how it depended on what the projects that came in and kind of I guess the merits of those projects, kind of determined what that breakdown was.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think it was not something that was determined beforehand that we were going to start moving to more proactive versus reactive. It's just kind of how the process has worked over the past couple of cycles in terms of what's been submitted.
Okay. Thank you for that. Just maybe a follow-up. Wondering if the applicants will see the detailed scoring, now that we've kind of seen the rankings and understanding that's going to change as these, or potentially change as these last three projects are addressed. So wondering if we can see the detailed scoring, and then could you talk a little bit about the process from here? Because this is an information item today. There's no action. So I'm kind of curious what the next steps look like to finalize the funding scenario.
Okay. The detailed, I can't remember what we did. I mean, I don't remember how how we approached the detailed scoring, but I don't think, I think it is something that's open, especially if somebody had an issue with their scoring. What was the?
Okay, so Mr. Chair, follow up if you don't mind. So would you just want individual applicants to reach out to you if they wanted to see that detailed scoring? And then my follow-up question was just process from here. This is not an action item today, it's an information item. So I'm curious how this gets finalized.
Right. I think, like I said, we'll follow up and try and figure out how to address these three that didn't get scored. I think following that, those three will probably be scored based on whatever gets determined from that meeting, and then we would likely, and any changes that would be made to this. I mean, we're gonna likely bring in all of the scorers that scored their individual parts to look at those three and then adjust the list, and then the list will be sent out again for another review. I think once that list is finalized, we bring it back, and then it becomes an action item. Is that how it works? Steve, maybe you can.
Sure.
It's been 2 years since I've participated in exactly how that worked.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair and others. So this will be an action item at the October Funding and Programming Committee. So this will track at the same time as the rest of the regional solicitation. It'll be a separate approval. It goes all the way to the council, and so that's why a combination of Corey, Derek, Luer, and Lars are coming to this committee, TAC, and then TAB for kind of information items before the official approval next month.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I had a question.
Yep, go ahead.
Is it I'm wondering, not knowing the timing, is it possible to have those scored within next week so that a new list could be presented as an info item to TAC?
I'm sure that we're going to try and get them scored as soon as possible, and exactly how we want to approach that. At this point, Lars is out of the office until Tuesday, so that's kind of I'm pretty sure we're going to jump on this as soon as he gets back, and then try and pull everyone together to see how best to approach it. And I'm sure it'll be a priority among myself and him and the other scorers, if kind of just depending on what their schedules are and that.
Okay. Any other questions? Hearing none, lots of work to do before the October meeting, so.
Great.
Appreciate the information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, moving on to the regional solicitation funding scenarios. Steve?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And I know we did a joint meeting here with the TAC so that the technical staff could see it before it did go to TAB. And I think several members of this committee who also don't serve on TAC attended that and asked a series of really good questions there. So we're gonna circle back here, and certainly a combination of Elaine and I will kind of give you what we heard at TAB yesterday on this front. But Joe, did you share the last one, or is it Bethany? Okay, yeah, Bethany, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide here. Keep going. One more. So really, one of the big topics. Yeah, that's good. One of the big topics at TAB yesterday that we asked for input on was the new carbon reduction program. And so it's roughly $8 million a year from 23 to 2027. And we're also, because it is a new funding program, we are bringing this issue as an information item to our Transportation Committee of the Met Council here on Monday to just get their take on what to do with this new funding source. So this came about with IIJA, and again, it's the fund project designed to reduce transportation emissions, defined as CO2 from on-road highway sources. This is a little different than bridges in that you could fund projects in really any modal category. Similar federal eligibility to CMAQ. So certainly most all transit projects and most all bike ped projects are eligible, as well as kind of additional project types beyond that, electric vehicle charging stations, congestion pricing, and other things. So, with this new money, MnDOT is just starting to meet with work groups of stakeholders across the state on the carbon reduction program. So some of that money, about 65% of that goes to various urban areas throughout the state. And the remainder, 35%, stays with the state DOT for distribution. So as defined in IIJA, within 2 years of that bill being signed, the state has to submit a carbon reduction strategy. So you can see the planning is kind of behind the money being available here. So within 2 years, they're gonna MnDOT will have that strategy submitted. Part of the reason we're hearing from MnDOT not to spend all of that money during this solicitation cycle, because we haven't done the planning work for what the best use of the money is. The council is doing a transportation and climate change multimodal measures study led by Tony Fisher. That could help inform what we do with the money. And then Cole is doing our travel demand management study that's been ongoing here for a while. So these are all good inputs to kind of help us best think about what we want to do in this region with the money. Next slide, please. So what we brought to tab yesterday was some of these issues here. So right now, the regional solicitation process, while we do have eligible project types, we don't necessarily measure CO2 reduction from projects, except in transit expansion and in the travel demand management areas. So in many of the other ones, we kind of get close, but we don't actually have measurement tools in there. So there's kind of a mismatch there. So we're working on that with some of the planning work that we just mentioned on the last slide. But at the same time, there's money available in 2023 and 24 that's kind of near-term money that we need to make decisions on. So we also heard from MnDOT, start thinking about allocating and programming, especially those earlier year funds to projects, because especially if you decide to do capital projects with that money, as you all know, it takes several years to develop those. If you do something else more TDM related, maybe the time frame is shorter. So we sought input from TAB yesterday, and then, like I said, the Transportation Committee here on Monday for both kind of the near term couple of years, and then maybe what we want to do in the long term, whether it's somehow use it in the solicitation. There's kind of a wide variety of things you could do there, or some other new process that would be developed to best allocate that funding across the region. What we heard from TAC, first of all, and then some of you were there, was to consider options in the regional solicitation. We heard, I would say, something similar at TAB yesterday, and Elaine, you can chime in here too, was to start thinking about developing some options, especially for those earlier years, and particularly on the bike ped lists where we aren't able to go as far down. Really lists that are 69 projects long between the three categories in bike ped. Elaine or Cole, you want to add anything there on this carbon reduction?
Let's see.
No.
I do have a lot of notes, so let me.
It was a long meeting yesterday. Yeah.
Yes, it was, and there was a lot of good discussion. So regarding the carbon reduction, let's see, I'm gonna skim through this. So the request of staff to indicate projects that could be funded by adding carbon reduction to the scenarios, particularly in the trails category. And they recommended not having a separate solicitation for this funding to save applicant resources, was the discussion for that.
Thank you. Yeah. Next slide. So again, we have two funding scenarios. We didn't get any big ideas for new funding scenarios. So I think people were, with 100 million more than usual in the regional solicitation, you're seeing that the top projects across all the categories are getting funded. And really, we're able to dig down pretty deep into some of those lists with the money available. It's just a matter of kind of what the last few projects on each of those lists are going to be is where we're at with some of the scenarios that we put together to date. So we'll go through that a little bit here in a few minutes. Next slide, please. This is interesting. It's, you know, showing the difference between the two scenarios, midpoint and bike ped heavy, and it's a shift of $16 million from roadways and transit into bike ped in an attempt to kind of pay homage to the fact that we had a lot of applications in bike ped and also the public input or public survey results. One of the general summaries there was that people wanted more bike ped investment. So we got two pretty good scenarios, I think, on the table here, and some either one of those two or some combination of the two might seem to be taking some bit of hold here, but you know, still open to what some of the committees will say, especially at TAB and Transportation Committee. So next slide. Unique projects is one outstanding item here that we're haven't finalized. So we do have a second meeting of that unique projects group that was just scheduled here, and it will take place in early October, I believe, Joe. And so again, the scoring committee there is policymakers, including TAB and a couple council members are scoring those projects. And we have 3 requests that came in for unique projects, and they total about the amount available. So that committee will make a recommendation on that, as well as the travel behavior inventory request and regional model for $733,000. Yeah, Joe's saying October 9th is that meeting. So we hope to, by the October TAB meeting, that scoring committee will recommend to fund 0, 1, 2, or correction, October 10th. That scoring committee of TAB and council members will make a recommendation to fund anywhere between 0, 1, 2, or 3 of those unique project requests. And so that's yet to be seen. And then as part of this solicitation, again, we're always funding more near-term projects. So we'd set aside some level of funding. Last time it was $4.5 million. So if we want to do that again, that would be an open discussion too. What's that amount? Right now, we held the line and kept it at $4.5 million. Next slide. And here's the schedule moving forward. Same for HSIP, would follow the same timeline. So next month will be coming before you for an action item. Next slide. And that's it. I wrote down a few specific topics we wanted to get some input from the technical committee on. If you could go to the tables, Bethany, please. I saw it a second ago. There we go. Okay, can you make it maybe slightly bigger if you could? Yeah, so the first topic that we wanted to generate some discussion on was our approach to, we had 2 projects that applied in both, or 2 projects that are above the funding line, I should say, that applied in both the HSIP funding and in the regional solicitation. So we've marked those on the page. If you could just go into the spot mobility area and just zoom in a little bit there. And so there's also a rule that states you can't win both HSIP and regional solicitation money. And we put that in place either last cycle or the cycle before. And really the spirit of that rule is that, say, a $10 million interchange project can kind of max out on the regional solicitation and then come back and get $2 million and now have $12 million. Kind of double up on the money essentially between HSIP and the regional solicitation. And that's because HSIP wanted to promote smaller project types and not give $2 million for, say, a $40 million project. So that's really the reason we put that rule in there. We had two two projects that are above the funding line. Again, the first one is number 5 on the spot mobility list, Carver County. And in both cases, what we're showing here is they applied for $2.4 million. And what we show on the funding table is that 1.4 million would come from the regional solicitation and $1 million from HSIP. So kind of a purist reading of that rule would say, well, you can't fund them with both, but they're not double dipping and kind of getting above the request. So they're still getting their request for the regional solicitation of $2.4 million. It's just that a portion is coming from HSIP, a portion is coming from STP. And the logic behind that is because we've got two projects, both requested higher in the solicitation. So you would, if you just followed that, they would likely take the solicitation money that we'd have to do less projects in the solicitation and more in HSIP, which might be fine. But in this case, we kind of did 50-50 on the money going in. So we can go down a little bit further on each of those two lists. So the other project, if you could scroll down, Bethany, to number 16 on the reconstruction list, that's a city of Shakopee. So again, we're not proposing to fund any more than their request. And if you could scroll to the right just a little bit. So Shakopee's request for the solicitation was $3,700,000 and change. So we're recommending $2 million come out of HSIP and the remainder $1.7 million come out of STP. And so if you add those two together, it's about 50-50 for how much is coming out of HSIP and STP. So we did hear from Hennepin County here yesterday at TAB that they wanted to have some discussion on the reading of that rule. If people thought that our approach was sound, made some level of sense, or if we wanted to kind of hold tight to that rule. And then in this case, we'd have to pull back on some of these projects that you see here, the project list, as a result, which would be fine. And we would just have to likely pull back on probably one spot mobility project on the list. So that was issue number 1, and maybe I'll just quickly go through the other two. So one was the HSIP. Number 2, we had some discussion at TAB yesterday on the bridge program. If you could just scroll down slightly, Bethany. So on bridges, we're showing funding 4 out of the 5 bridges. And the discussion at the TAB level, and again, we've got the new on-system bridge program, which is being used to fund the projects shown here. And so the question that was brought up was, should we fund all 5 of those? And we do have a bridge target of $10 million against a target. So TAB always had the discretion to fund 0 or 20 million or something in between. So we've put 3 years of that bridge funding here, 25, 26, and 27, and are leaving, so we're funding in total, $14 million or $15 million of bridges, and leaving the last project unfunded. But we did hear from at least one person at TAB, well, should we fund all 5 of those, given that we have a new pot of money for bridges? So that was, I guess, issue number 2. And then lastly, on my list at least, and I'll turn it over to Elaine, would be on the travel demand management list. And just show you. So the question that we had at TAB was, what do all the colors mean? And so the gray, what's shown in gray, again, this is a set aside from last cycle. So we have money available from the set aside, and this is 24 and 25 money, to fund the 5 out of the 7 projects that were submitted in innovative TDM. You could fund number 6 and number 7 on that list, but it's up with the money available. So that's another, close to $1 million to fund the last 2 projects. We did hear from at least 1 or 2 people at TAB across all these programs is, do we want to fund the last projects or last couple projects on any list in general? And this one was called out as one to maybe garner some more discussion as to should we put that funding here or put that funding elsewhere. There's kind of a number of places you could put it, either up above on the transit list, shift it to bike ped, or something else. So those are three things on my list. So again, the interpretation of the HSIP rule, bridge funding, whether we fund 4 or 5 bridges, and then I think the general topic of fully funding out project lists versus maybe looking at the final scores and seeing if you want to fund something less than the full list. So Elaine, turn to you for a second here. Anything else on your notes?
Yeah, I got quite a bit more.
I know you do, yeah.
Yeah. So if you actually scroll up just a little bit on the transit, that my first point is related to. So yeah, right up over. So if you notice, there's the red check marks for the BRT projects. TAB had adopted a rule for not funding more than 7 million or up to 7 million for BRT projects. And so there was some discussion on that and maybe having some flexibility with the funding. With the additional funding, the 7 million maximum could be set aside, or an option could be to prorate that 7 million up. So that it was set up so that BRT projects did not take all the funding if they were scoring high like they had in the past. So in this instance, for this round, that isn't an issue. There was also some discussion on the amount of funding that was now available compared to what was initially approved. We were estimating about 200 million, now we're about 300 million. And that may have affected where some projects applied for funding. There was one in particular that last round had applied in transit modernization and was scoring low enough that they decided to try on the pedestrian, where more projects had traditionally been funded. And because there's additional funding this round, where they had just been missing the being funded, if they had applied knowing there was more money, they probably would have applied in this category. So that was brought up of applicants not knowing where to apply and having new money come in, but it's an unknown. And then there was discussion on distribution of funds within the funding modes based on number of applications submitted. This is what we staff starts us for the midpoint. And then TAB was advised that they could make recommendations for distribution of funds within the modal category, and nothing came out of that right now. They also requested, based on the amount of new funding that came in, requested staff to indicate projects that received, it was the original money versus the new money. So drawing the lines where the newer projects are being funded with that additional funding. So that can be easily done by drawing lines because it's about a third additional projects. Let's see. Requested staff to indicate projects that could be funded by adding carbon reduction funding to the scenarios, particularly to the trails category, and recommended not having a separate solicitation for this funding to save applicant resources. They also requested that staff indicate projects that received federal earmark funding, similar to those that are marked for equity or have been resubmitted. And then there was also a question whether earmark funding on projects could be considered in the future scoring. So that's for next round. And then as Steve mentioned about the funding that was allocated to bridges, and it was a couple members suggested allocating the original 10 million targeted to bridges and then add the new bridge funding on top in order to fund all the bridges. There was discussion on points that are awarded to projects. There was concern of funding the lowest ranked projects on some of the categories. And it was noted by one other TAB member that projects are rated against projects that are submitted versus a metric. So just because they're scoring lower does not make them bad projects. for some categories, the total points were awarded in the full range and others were not. And what that means is some of them were getting 900 points for their top scoring. And in other categories, the top were in the 700s. So there was a question on whether there was something with the measures themselves, the way they were set up, that applicants couldn't get higher points. So be careful of looking at projects between categories of saying who scored better. And we requested staff to look at the points assigned to the measures in the next round to see that projects are being rated in the full scale or full range, that they could get the total points. And then there was also questions on the scoring process itself. So Councilmember Barber has recommended that staff set up a virtual workshop to discuss the scoring process. And then as Steve noted, that the rules were not allowed to fund both projects in both HSIP and regional solicitation, but as he explained, it's not double funding them, was splitting the funding. So, and then noted that this will be discussed at funding and programming. There was also, one of the options had been presented was awarding funding to partially funded projects in the past. And there was concern of going with that precedent if they did do that, as this has not occurred in the past. And then the Vice Chair Gatella requested that tab members send in requests for additional scenario recommendations. So we expect to be getting more. So that I'll be sending out an email to do that. I already received 10 of the counties. I have not read it. The email just came in.
Cole, you had your hand up a second ago here. Did Elaine cover it, or did you have something else?
The only two things I was going to say were I think that the applicant that applied for the transit modernization shifted to trails because of the BRT rule. They were skipped over last time because of the BRT rule. Their project actually would have been funded otherwise. And I also just wanted to know, a lot of the comments about Tab's comments, a lot of those that Elaine mentioned were just from one member. So I don't want to, not necessarily one, but like a lot of things she said were individual comments that were being made from different members. So it wasn't a consensus at Tab on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, they only seemed the consensus was adding a scenario with the carbon reduction funds.
Yep. Okay, Mr. Chair, I think we'll turn it back to you at this point. See if people have additional questions or comments on any of the discussion topics we brought forward here today.
Yep. Thanks, Steve, Elaine, Cole. Lots to digest here. I'll just open it up right away to the committee. Does anybody have any questions for staff here at this time?
Mr. Chair, could I suggest that we kind of take this piecemeal and entertain conversation about each of those topics individually so we don't get too confused?
I would agree. That's a good point. How do we want to proceed with that?
Can I just ask an overall question about the tables?
Okay.
So the original tables that we saw at the joint meeting to the ones from today had some shifting in funding on the bike ped heavy, where, you know, we had a couple ped projects that were funded in a safe routes to school that were above the line. Now they're below the line. I was just wondering if you could just give an overview of what changed from that meeting to this one.
Yeah, I can do that. Thank Mr. Chair and committee members. So the money is still shown in that funding area. So I think you're talking about the bike ped heavy in the pedestrian safe routes to school area, right? And yeah, I think
correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So if you look at the last row, yet to program, the midpoint is essentially programmed all that money. In the bike ped, we held back some of the money, and it's kind of a tricky conversation. But so we've been weighing a little bit, especially the near-term funding, 23 and 24, like using some of the carbon reduction to get further down the trails list. So The problem in kind of thinking through that as we've kind of internally been developing options is, if you scroll up just a little bit, Bethany, on the multi-use trail list, especially in that bike ped heavy, you can see there's 2 ties right back to back. So you have 4 projects. They're all big projects. So collectively, it's almost, it's a wall of $20 million to get over. And so you're, based on kind of how we allocated the funding, based on the number of projects that were submitted, your decision making may change as to how those last projects fall, whether you have $3 million left, or say you add in another $16 million in. And those are some of the carbon, if Transportation Committee agrees on at least the 2 years of the near term funding, 23 and 24, if they agree with that general approach and it goes that way, we would want to bring some options that kind of go further down the pedestrian safe routes to school list, but maybe some options that push as much money as we can towards the trail list. And so those are maybe future decision makings, but I will say the money's still there, and in that modal area, it's still kind of some discussion and jockeying to be done here on how to bring that to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Do we want to go through some of these questions individually, or how do we want to get some of these questions answered by the
chairs?
Yeah.
And I just following up with what Steve said on the additional funds. Are we going to see some version that does that or not? Or is that what's wanted by folks? And where's that at?
Yeah. So thank you, Mr. Chair and Craig. I think that was your voice. So first thing where you want to bring it to the policymakers, both the TAB and the Transportation Committee, because it is a new funding program. So there's, as we went through, there's a wide variety of things you could do with the money. So if we get agreement from the policymakers, then we'll bring options back through the committees. It may be a little bit of a 2-step process too. So it might be the case where it's either a separate action item, a separate month even, where we do the carbon reduction money, or for sure a separate action the same month, maybe even a different month. But I think you will, if we hear something similar from Transportation Committee, we will bring some options all the way through the committees. Yeah.
At this point yesterday, TAB requested just adding some projects in so they could see what those look like.
Yep.
And for clarification, what projects are we talking about? What categories?
They're eligible in just about every category. As Steve mentioned, TDM and transit are the only ones that actually mentioned some type of carbon reduction in this measures. However, TAB seemed to lean toward funding more in the trails category because there are so many applications there. And so that was where they had asked for the funding to be added in. So when the next scenario comes through with those projects added, my guess is TAB members will be giving their recommendation more trails versus all the safe routes to school, because I did hear that from one member. So there would be definitely options within that modal range where to put those projects. Similar to what they were recommending for the bridge category, is funding that 10 million for bridges target and adding that bridge money. So then they'd say fund the projects with the original solicitation money and then add trails. So they wanted to see what that looked like.
Okay, Elaine, how much is the additional bridge money?
It was, Steve, I'm going to defer to Steve on that one.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so too, on the carbon reduction money, not all of our project categories are eligible. Maybe that's just one thing to note. there is wide eligibility, but it's primarily in the non-roadway mode. So, we couldn't stick, you couldn't stick it in strategic capacity, for instance, or something like that. It's got very defined eligibilities. But so your question on the bridge is there's $4.5 million available per year of bridge funding, starting in 2023 all the way through 2027. The near-term money we would need to put on past selected projects that were funded to the last solicitation, because you're not going to start a new federally funded bridge rehab or reconstruction in this program year. So that's why we put the 3 years onto new projects in this list: 25, 26, 27. $4.5 million a year, so that came roughly to 15 million.
So that 15 million plus another 5 million instead of 10 million would fund all the bridge projects.
Yeah.
So
which then would mean another project is not funded in the roadway categories.
Yeah, so I think that's the question at hand is, we're sticking a new federal source into our process, and it's not a perfect fit with the money and the years and everything. So there's a kind of a variety of things we had to assume to make it work. And so that's why, like I said, we put the first 2 years of that money on past selected projects, the last 3 years of money onto new projects, and you end up with $15 million of bridge projects, which is higher than the target, but it's not a doubling up of the target, which was and the new money.
Right, so we're just using up the new money to get to that $15 million target, basically.
Correct, yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Okay.
And that's where Tab had a couple members said, does that bridge money added like regular money, or does it add it on top of the other the solicitation money?
Yeah, and so we took the interpretation of a target by tack. If it was dedicated money to bridges, we may have taken a different tack, but because it was a target, soft target, Tab, ultimately has the discretion to go one way or the other on bridges. We took it as a looser interpretation of that $10 million target, I would say.
So at the technical review at technical committees, it may be providing a recommendation if another bridge is funded, which project would you not fund?
Yeah, we'd have. Yeah,
but if we're already using up the new money in the bridge category, I don't know I guess we'd have to look at the impacts of where we funded the last bridge project in that category. Well, how does that impact some of these other, or what money would be taken away from other projects? How that impact look? So.
Yeah, and part of our other kind of thinking on this too is, sometimes, well, that's one of the discussion items we had too, was we didn't want to fund out a category. You had a 150 point drop from number 4 to number 5 on that list. And so that's some of our thinking behind not by funding 4 versus 5, not funding out every project on the list and the drop and the 150 point drop in points there. So there was a kind of a clear break point.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I guess I'm curious if we're looking for like official actions on these questions, or it's just more of an informal discussion, or what kind of guidance does staff need?
Yeah, Thank you, Mr. Chair and Scott. So this is not an action item. So I think more of a consensus, if there's a consensus opinion, and maybe there isn't on all of these issues, that's fine. But I think we just wanted to daylight some of these things we heard at TAB yesterday and see if there's kind of a technical angle to it or general thinking from the group, and that would help inform kind of what direction we go on a few of these issues that came up. So not an action item, no. So anything else on? I see there's one hand. Maybe I'll hold tight for a second, Mr. Chair.
All right. I don't see the hand up.
Oh, Aaron. Is that Aaron? Is that from before?
No, he
Yeah,
just,
that's from before, and it's
okay.
related to the transit. So I'm fine waiting until we get to that.
Okay. So anything else? I guess.
Well, just a comment for me would be, you know, if we fund all the projects in some of these categories that have one or two projects left, I mean, what was the impact to some of these other, where are we getting the money from, and what projects are we not funding in other categories? I'd just like to have a little more information on that, I suppose.
the other thing that Steve had mentioned at TAB is over programming was put in at 9%. So if TAB went up a little higher than that, that would also free up a little bit more money. However, we haven't been having too many projects withdraw in the last couple of years. So if you over program, it comes out of the next solicitation if projects don't withdraw.
Yeah, but not, you know, similar to the carbon reduction, Mr. Chair, the bridge, these bridge projects and the 15 million that's going to it is outside of the modal funding ranges. So just like with carbon reduction, we didn't want it just to go on the pot. Instead, it's the 15 million is coming outside of the modal funding ranges because it's a new funding source. So now you can probably argue that either way, whether that was the wrong or right choice, but at least for this cycle, we thought that made some level of sense.
Okay. I see a hand up, Scott. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I guess since we're still on the bridge topic, Mr. Chair, I guess I don't know that I have a clear opinion on it, but I think it's a fair question to ask, you know, as to what was the logic behind basically not significantly increasing the bridge funding compared to the last solicitation, because from what I understand, the IIJA bill did significantly increase bridge funding nationwide, but that doesn't appear to be reflected in what we're doing with our investment. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying we're taking a different approach than what was in the IIJA bill. And so I'm just saying that's a fair question to ask, but I think, you know, the devil's in the detail, like's been mentioned, you know, if we do decide to fund all the bridges, then what project gets dropped off from another list? So there's a winner and a loser if you do that. And so I just think we need to be careful about how we approach that, I guess.
Good comment. So, and I'm looking at some of these other categories too that have maybe one or two projects that still aren't funded, and you know, just looking at again at the scoring of those projects, there are some pretty significant drop-offs in scoring from the projects that are proposed to be funded versus the ones that aren't. So, you know, another comment would be that, you know, if we do fund some of these other projects, you know, in these categories, taking away money from other projects, you know, some of those other projects maybe are better or scored better, more competitive than some of the ones that we potentially would be funding some of these other categories if we would fund all the projects.
Okay. So I'm not hearing, Mr. Chair, maybe a consensus on that one. You want to, but maybe some more discussions needed. Do you want to, should we keep moving through these here just so people have time?
Yeah, exactly. Let's keep going. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So the other one we brought to light was the how we treat the HSIP rule, Highway Safety Improvement Program rule. Again, we kind of explained we took about 50% of the money from HSIP, 50% from the regional station here, STP money, and didn't necessarily did not double dip on those projects, but wanted to see if people agreed with that approach to the rule or not.
Okay, did anybody have any comment on that rule?
Mr. Chair, this is Craig.
Craig.
Just, you know, I understand you're not fully funding from each category, but it almost seems like you're going to get into a situation where you can play endless games if more and more people submit it in both categories. And so that's just my initial thought, is that they can apply for each, but knowing they can only get funded in one. And I would say that we need to just fund one in whatever category they have, you know, I guess, however it shakes out, I guess, with the overall scoring. But then, you know, decision can be made if they accept the HSIP or they accept the other, I guess, if they both get funded in that, instead of splitting it around and stuff. Just my opinion on that. Because I knew you couldn't get funded in both categories, and opening it up to this, I think there can be a lot more people doing this in the future, and then just might even make it tougher on staff to try to keep track of or you know, find a way to fund it. So just my thoughts.
Thanks, Craig. Any other thoughts on the HSIP splits?
Mr. Chair, this is Emily. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity, if maybe we consider fully funding them both through regional solicitation, though I realize that would potentially require maybe a bit more over programming on that end.
Okay, Scott or Steve, you got a comment on that?
Yeah, so so Emily's bringing up, could you, yeah, so if you were given the choice, both of the applicants would take the higher amount, which would be through the regional solicitation, and you'd given the amount of money right now, you'd have to peel back that amount of money. So at least probably one spot mobility project. So Emily, I think, is asking, could you just over program by whatever that amount would be to retain that, whatever projects you would lose? Is that, I think that's the comment.
Yes. Yep.
Yep. I think that's an option. And then you would, I think the decision recommendation from this group would be, you know, is that the right level of over programming? Yes or no? And do you want to do that? So I think that it's a decent, pretty good idea. Yeah.
Okay, comment.
Chair Darren Milkey, if I could.
Go ahead, Darren.
Well, it's always great to have an asterisk next to your name or project.
Yes.
I guess we would just have some concerns just because the way the language is written for the rule says you shouldn't be doing a splitting of funds. If we would move ahead with doing what is shown currently, we would just want something, either the rules updated to reflect that this is possible, or some reassurance in writing so that it's not an issue 4 or 5 years down the road when we want to actually construct the project. And again, just so future staff are aware of this situation as well. So more of a comment than a question, I guess.
I think we can clarify, the way it's written is you can't get funded by both for the same project. There was never any thought of, we hadn't thought about the splitting of funds where you get partially funded by both. And in this case, it works out because the projects are large enough. It doesn't affect the match because HSIP funding is 90-10 and solicitation funding is 80-20. Both of these projects are going to be 80-20 no matter what, so it doesn't affect that match in HSIP. In the future, that might affect another one. But that is something that we could probably clarify, that it's not that they're double getting funding, but if you want to allow split funding.
Yeah, I think for our situation, say our project was $8 million and we were maxed out at the $3.5 million. I think this was spot mobility. And then we would get, somebody could interpret that maybe we could get both then up to the 80% of the total. So I guess that's our only concern about opening it up to splitting it. I get what you're saying as well. It's just the way it's read, we're just concerned that someone may take it that, hey, you can only get one funding source. So we would just ask that maybe some consideration be given towards rewording it to better fit this type of situation and the spirit of what, if that was the spirit of the intent a few years back when it was set.
Typically, we don't, for those HSIP type projects, in the past, there was a maximum project cost. And so this didn't, and they removed that or raised that maximum so that it never was an issue of, or you couldn't fund both or split them up because HSIP was a maximum. By removing that maximum for the HSIP, this allowed this to happen. So if you want to say you can only get one type of funding, you can recommend that. And if by doing that, you tell TAB, we would fully fund these projects, this one wouldn't get funded unless you award more funding by doing that.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing at the very least is better clarity moving forward on the rules. Okay.
Yeah. And also in the future, there may be an issue if it's smaller projects, when it's that 90-10 on one. And that could create a little bit of a mess of trying to, you would have to say about each project, if you add into that rule, if they did get split funding, it would be 80-20.
Yeah.
So if we
and
do,
that could be one of the recommendations for the rules change if that's to move forward with that.
And then for the HSIP recommendations coming forward, there would have to be other projects indicated that would be funded because of those two projects not being funded. And maybe it'll be 1, 2, or 3 of those new projects being scored. If they fall in the higher ranking.
So Mr. Chair, as far as this meeting at hand, what do you get a sense from the room here if people want to let this play out as it's written, or if people want to go back? Either way, it seems like we need to clarify the rule moving forward, but you get a sense for where you want to go here.
Yeah, is there any more comments on the HSIP discussion?
Mr. Chair, this
Go
is
ahead,
Jenny
Jenny.
Hager. I want to agree with what Craig was saying. My concern is that this is going to really complicate this development of funding scenarios, and I think it's unclear. And I'm picturing a scenario where you've got projects that are close to that funding line in both the regional solicitation and/or HSIP, and Met Council staff, you kind of made a decision on how much money in these scenarios should come from each of those pots between those two projects. And, you start playing around with that split along with those scores, and it kind of goes from 2-dimensional chess to 3-dimensional chess in a big hurry in how these scenarios get developed and the jockeying that might happen as a result of being able to play kind of between these two funding pots. So I think it adds a lot of extra complication. When, up to this point, I think it was pretty clear you could apply to both, but, you get funding from one. So that's where I'm at on it.
Good comment. I would agree with that as well.
Okay, so that's, I think that's swinging in favor of kind of following the strict interpretation of the rule and clarifying it for the future, right? So I'm hearing.
Is there any other comments on that? Anything else? Yeah, I think that's
okay.
Yeah, I think that's the last comment we had then.
Okay. Darren just doesn't want to asterisk by his name. Who does, though, he says.
He always has by his name, though.
So the other thing, last thing on my list, and then we'll maybe Elaine has some others. I know Aaron wanted to comment on the transit, but we did put, we did have some comments at tab about the last one or two TDM projects that we went back and funded, and not that we have to solve it today, but more so just wanted to kind of keep you in tune to what tab was, at least a couple members at tab were saying on the funding out these lists. So any other comments on that?
Any other comments on funding out these other lists or these other categories? And again, Steve, the carbon reduction money can be utilized in these categories for transit?
They can, yes. Yeah, both transit and TDM are eligible for carbon reduction.
It is Safe Routes to School. I'm assuming that would not be.
Yes.
No,
all the
it is.
trails would too. Yeah,
all the transit. Okay, all the paved stuff would be too. Okay.
Yep.
Because I'm just looking over the funding scenarios here. There's only 2 to 4 projects each of those categories that are being funded right now. I mean, there's a lot of good Safe Routes to School projects in that list, and they're cost-effective projects too. I think only $1 million bed projects. You can do a lot of good work with sticking some of that carbon money into some of these other categories, not just the PED projects, because the next PED projects on the list are those are 4 or 5 projects. So a lot of projects looking at the PED facility and the school projects as well.
And that was like.
Yep, so we'll bring some options back that. Well, we got to hear from Transportation Committee, but if so, we would I think we'd bring a couple options back to the group.
Yeah. That's great. Are there any comments on scenarios that staff should be brought back by this committee? Any suggestions there?
Jonathan again.
Go ahead.
I don't know about overall scenarios, but I know you talked about the funding, all the projects in one category or whatever, but I know it's against each other, just the ones they're in, but when you look at the total scores of these projects, some of them are very low scoring that are being recommended for funding. And the only reason I bring this up is a few years ago when we had our project, I mean, that was one criticism by others that ours, only had half the points. So why should they be funding our project? So just a comment on that. I think that's something to think about when you look at some of the other, modes. Some are, scoring pretty decent and not getting funded, and other ones are in other categories are going pretty low in the points in their categories, to even like a quarter of the points and getting funded. So just something to bring up. I don't know if that was even talked about, but then we're also talking about potentially fully funding in all the categories, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with.
Tab did bring that up for discussion too. And there was also I was reminded too that some of this are scoring low because of who they're scoring against, because they're each year. Because that was a comment that was, how come a score was lower this year than last time? Because they're scoring, the project's the same, but it's how they're scored against another project, and so or the other projects submitted. So sometimes the score isn't relative to whether it's a good project or not. It just how it compared to the ones that they were competing against. And so that's why TAB has never had a cutoff for scoring, because they also mentioned that they want staff to look at some of the total scores where the top score in some of these categories were like 700, where others were in the 900. So the range of the scoring and who's doing the scoring may affect the total score. But again, it will be, if you want to make a recommendation that you don't fund those lower projects and fund other, because they do have that funding range that they can work within.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm hearing is this committee's not recommending maybe funding out some of those categories because some of those projects are scored fairly low. I guess that would be just one comment.
Chair Darren Melke, if I could.
Go ahead, Darren.
I guess kind of like, I'll take it in two parts. In the past, several regional solicitations, we've had different funding scenarios, whether it was heavy on strategic capacity, heavy on modernization of roadways, heavy on ped trails, heavy on transit. And I guess we just have two at this point. I know you're talking about adding some more, but I guess the question is why are we not following similar past practice like that to give the committee more information to kind of go through and see if it's worth funding down to the bottom on some of these or doing a blend of all the different options. I know we tend to gravitate towards the midpoint for the big categories like roadway, transit, ped, bike stuff. So I guess that's my first question.
And I can answer it. Yeah, typically the scenarios that are developed are based on what TAB asks for. And even yesterday, they didn't come up with any new ones unless some get emailed to me.
Okay.
I mean, it's based on what they request. So
I guess that would probably be our request. That was in the past, that's been helpful to have those. Maybe you don't have to have everyone, but that was helpful in the past. Just because there isn't, I know there's precedents about like ranges and midpoints for the big categories, but there's not any really written practice of how you divvy out like the roadway funding in particular. And no really set practice depending on how many projects apply in a certain category either to help. It's just kind of, right now it looks like it's just randomly picked, although I mean looks like there's some reasons why you went down to where you did. So I guess that would be our suggestion.
Yeah, it's within each modal category, it's based on the number of applications that are submitted. That's how we determined how far to go down each of those lists is the first blush on that. Usually we put together a bunch of them. So you're saying, yeah, typically we see 5 or 6 of them. We also, which is helpful, we've also heard from TAB that it's overwhelming. And, this year we've got the 2 new programs, on system bridge and the carbon reduction. So it's getting more complicated for them to understand. And we even saw that yesterday at TAB, that to try and distill the decision-making down was very difficult to do for people to even understand what they're being asked of them. So one thought we had was to bring them a smaller list of funding scenarios, at least at the front end, because we have more money. So in most categories, you're getting the top, at least 2 or 3 in each category, sometimes more. But if other people have conceptual ideas, I think that's what Elaine's going to be emailing out to the TAB to get some additional feedback. But I'd maybe caution about putting together too many here because of the kind of the multi-layered decision making that we're going to have to get through.
Yeah, TAB typically asks for about 3, so they don't have too many. And the other thing about yesterday's TAB meeting, there were a lot of alternates at the meeting. So I expect when I send out the email with the notes here that I read today, some of the regular members may weigh in on what they want to see versus the alternates who were overwhelmed with it being new. Because there was a lot of even questions on the scoring process itself, so they hadn't been in the full, the full long 2-year cycle long enough to understand.
Mhm.
I guess it would just be more so for probably this group is if you wanted to add subcategories that you would roll up and hide and just show that tab the total for each like roadway, bike ped, transit for their use for this group, since we don't really have a set practice for the subcategories. It'd just be helpful for this group. So I'll just leave it there. Related to that is the carbon reduction, and right now I don't believe that's included in these numbers. I guess a scenario where that is included, whether, and it's probably two separate scenarios besides after hearing the conversation earlier, is whether it's on top of our typical funding ranges, or if it's just using what projects we already have. And we really believe that would help everyone. It would just give money to all the categories potentially. Get further down the list for PEDs, roadways, transit. So those would be very helpful if the carbon reduction was included as a scenario to look at.
So an option could be adding projects to the midpoint blue, and just adding some on there. And then the other would be adding all of them onto the bike ped.
It could be that, yeah.
Yeah. So Mr. Chair and Darren, some good comments there. Like I said before, because it's a new funding source and TAB and the council are just starting to weigh in on it, we're almost treating it like it may be more of a one-time deal. So that's why we're probably gonna have two separate decisions. If people said they want to put some number of years towards this, one would be the solicitation, make that decision. Step 2 would be the carbon reduction. Just because until we have more discussion on it, we're not sure if everyone's going to want to put it in the solicitation long term. So that's why we're planning to think about it as a discrete kind of decision making process and a discrete funding source.
Yeah, I think either way, the way Elaine described it, is adding it on top.
Yes,
would work too. So either way.
Yeah, I think Elaine and I are saying the same thing. It'd basically be an add-on to what you're seeing right here. Yep. Mm-hmm. In a different color.
Okay, so how many scenarios are you thinking, Steve, come back with?
Well, if we bring carbon, I'm not trying to put the cart before the horse here, but if tab is set and we got to get council concurrence on this, that some level of carbon reduction. So I think we would show add-on, if that's what happens here in the next couple of weeks, we would show add-ons as optional add-ons to what you see in these two scenarios, midpoint and bike ped heavy. What we've heard so far is go down the trails, ped and safe routes. So I think there could be more than one option under both midpoint and bike ped heavy to do that. That could be, I think, a good recommendation from this group going all the way up the chain. But like I said, we got multiple decision making going on here. That's why we're trying to keep it as simple as we can. If people like blue or orange or some combination of what you see already.
Or
plus
these
add-ons.
I was just thinking, if you added on green cells at the bottom of each saying this is the carbon money being added on.
Yeah, that may clear it up a little bit. Yep, sounds good. Jennifer, do you have a question?
I do have a question, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Steve and Elaine, I'm curious, you still have, quote unquote, yet to program dollars in many of these categories and in both scenarios. And I'm unclear how you're resolving that open question of how those dollars are going to get worked into these scenarios.
That would be, I would say, based on the recommendations we're getting from, part of it is if you add some of the carbon money and you have a partially funded project, you would just then take some of the leftover money. It's money that we can play with depending on what changes in scenarios. So it's not that it's left over, it's just if something changes, we might be filling in. And part of that could be some of that over programming that's already in there and not used. It's some wiggle room as we change our scenarios, I'd call it. And so some of that money on the bike ped, or if it was on the roadways, if there was some left over, that would go into those two partially funded projects. That if there was money still, I mean, that's where that wiggle room is.
Maybe I'm still trying to figure out early on and ask the question of why the bike ped heavy scenario in ped and safe routes to school changed from what was presented previously. So you went from kind of fully utilizing the funding that was available in that modal category to leaving 3.8 million unprogrammed. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around what the rationale was for that there and what you're going to do with that money. Because I think there's, some concurrence in going further down the list, especially in a bike ped heavy scenario. In those two categories, they're low cost, high benefit projects. And I know the carbon reduction program funding is, likely coming to the table, hopefully coming to the table, but I still wonder what's going on with that 3.8 million.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Jenny, so we're going to use that money. Don't worry about it. That's going to happen, and that will be one of the options is to go down more in ped and safe routes to school. Like I think Elaine was right. We wanted to have a little wiggle room here because even today with the HSIP kind of consensus that you had, so that's going to draw more money off the roadways. And there might be other little things that happen as we get input from these committees that's going to draw down the money. So kind of on purpose, we left some money out there, and maybe some over programming would be another kind of chunk of money that could be out there as we kind of narrow in on what these committees are looking to do with a maybe it's a geographic balance, a project at the end they want to get to. We want to make sure that there's some level of money still on the table to do that.
And that extra money may go away if we have to fund that extra bridge.
True. Okay.
It was just to show that we have as much as we could and then have some wiggle room as decisions are made.
I'm just looking into the chat right now. So Steve, were you going to put a bridge scenario together?
Oh, yeah.
Discussion.
Yeah, would you be able to read what's in the chat? I didn't have it open here, but just.
Oh, it just says, are you going to put together a new bridge scenario?
Yeah, we didn't come to perhaps a consensus there. I think what I heard from you, Mr. Chair, was it's kind of what's the opportunity cost of funding it. So if you fund it, what do you lose in the roadway categories? And so that's something that we could that's pretty easy to do. Yeah.
Okay.
So it would be a midpoint adjusted for bridges or something, and then what happens in that category?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a new scenario. It'd probably be just a couple bullet points of what would happen.
Okay. Sounds good. Right. Any other questions from the committee? Steve and Elaine, are there any questions, additional questions that we need to be answered at this committee, or any other information that you need from us?
No, that's all I have for my points.
Okay. Cole, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to. We looked at the MOU between the council and MnDOT, and which which kind of states how a lot of these funds are managed by the region. Particularly MnDOT, Met Council, and TAB's role. And just an FYI that the MOU doesn't leave it very generic. It actually explicitly says that TAB's role is with, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, I think it's like STP, block grant, CMAQ, and they might have even mentioned HSIP specifically in the MOU. But it doesn't mention the new programs, which means there's actually a point of unclarity in the region for how we should allocate, carbon reduction funds. And so I think that's one of the questions we're going to bring to the council on Monday as we discuss this. So I just wanted everyone to be aware of that, because normally we'd look to the MOU and what our agreements are for how these funds should be distributed. And just because they're so new, we don't actually currently have a documented way. And so I think we're going to have to work on the fly here, which I know you were all aware of and we had a long discussion today, but there isn't really an explicit thing that says TAB should distribute these, or the council is the MPO. So that's something that we're going to have to work through. And I think the council will probably give some direction to TAB on how to use these funds, but we'll look for that feedback on Monday and bring it to the next TAB meeting. Is that right, Steve?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Great. All right, I think this item, anything else, Steve?
Not on my end, no.
Okay. All right. I think we're good here then. So appreciate everybody's input on this one. All right, I think that's it for informational items then. So moving on to other business, is there any agency have any other business to discuss at this time, or any updates? Okay, hearing none, I think we can adjourn at this time. So thanks again, everyone. Meeting's adjourned. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks.